Bob Dylan stopped mid-song. He lowered his guitar. And he looked at the empty seat in the third row. When he understood why that seat was empty, the music was never the same again. The Orpheum Theatre in Minneapolis. November 1997. A small venue by Dylan's standards. Maybe 400 seats. The kind of intimate space where you could see the lines on the performer's face, where every breath through the harmonica carried weight. Dylan had been touring for decades by then. The never-ending tour, people called it. City after city. Stage after stage. The same songs rearranged, reimagined, played until their meanings shifted like sand. He was 56 years old. His voice had deepened into gravel. His face showed the years. He didn't play the hits the way people remembered them anymore. He played them the way they felt now. Slower. Darker. Like old photographs left too long in sunlight, fading but somehow more honest. Tonight's setlist was typical. Tangled Up in Blue. Opened. Then, It Ain't Me Babe. Then, Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. That song he'd written 34 years earlier when he was young and angry and convinced that walking away was the same thing as being free. He was 3 verses into Don't Think Twice when his eyes drifted across the audience. 4th row, left section. Full. 5th row, center. Full. 3rd row, right side, and there it was. A single empty seat. Red velvet upholstery worn smooth by decades of bodies. An island of absence in a sea of faces. Dylan's fingers stopped moving on the guitar strings. The chord hung in the air, then faded. The band behind him, sensing something wrong, gradually went quiet. Bass first, then drums, then the keyboard player's hands lifting from the keys. Silence filled the Orpheum Theatre. 400 people held their breath. Dylan stood perfectly still, guitar hanging from the strap around his shoulder, his eyes fixed on that empty third-row seat like it had spoken his name. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1963. Bob Dylan wasn't Bob Dylan yet. He was Bobby Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota, trying to become someone else in the coffee houses of Greenwich Village. 22 years old. Skinny. Intense. Carrying a guitar and a harmonica and enough ambition to crack the sidewalk beneath his feet. He'd already released 2 albums. Folk songs. Protest songs. Songs that borrowed from Woody Guthrie and the old ballads but twisted them into something sharper, angrier. People were starting to notice. The New York Times had called him the voice of his generation. He hated that phrase. Hated the weight of it. Hated that people wanted him to be a symbol instead of a person. There was a woman. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. Not a girlfriend. Not a lover. Eleanor was 57 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Brooklyn who came to Dylan's early shows at the Gaslight Cafe and sat in the same seat every time. 3rd row, right side, if the room had rows. If it didn't, she'd find a spot along the wall and lean there for the entire set, eyes closed, listening with an intensity that made Dylan uncomfortable. After his sets, she'd wait. Not at the front with the young women who wanted to talk to him, not with the journalists looking for quotes. She'd wait at the back, near the door, and when Dylan finally made his way through the crowd, she'd nod at him. Just a nod. No words. For 6 months, this was their entire relationship. Dylan would play. Eleanor would listen. She'd nod. He'd nod back. Either of them spoke. Until one night in October 1963, when Dylan was packing up his guitar after a particularly rough set. He debuted a new song that the audience hadn't understood, had gotten heckled by some drunk in the 2nd row, and Eleanor appeared beside him. "You stopped believing it," she said. First word she'd ever spoken to him. Dylan looked up, annoyed. "Believing what?" "The song. Halfway through the 2nd verse, you stopped believing what you were singing. That's why it fell apart. It fell apart because some asshole was yelling at me." "No," Eleanor said calmly. "It fell apart because you let him make you forget why you wrote it." Dylan wanted to argue. Wanted to tell this old woman that she didn't know anything about performance, about dealing with drunk hecklers, about the pressure of being called the voice of a generation when you were barely old enough to vote. Instead he said, "Why do you come to these shows?" Eleanor smiled. It was a sad smile. "Because you remind me of my son." "Your son's a musician?" "My son was a musician. He died in Korea. He played guitar. Wrote songs. Never got to record them. Never got famous. But he believed every word he sang, even when no one was listening." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. Black and white. Creased from years of handling. A young man in military uniform holding a guitar, smiling at the camera. "His name was Thomas," Eleanor said. "He had your same eyes. That same look like you're carrying something too heavy but you won't put it down." Dylan stared at the photograph. At this young man who looked nothing like him but somehow felt familiar. "Every time you perform," Eleanor continued, "I sit in the same spot Thomas would have sat if he'd lived. 3rd row, right side. And I listen the way he would have listened, believing every word, even the ones that hurt." She handed Dylan the photograph. "Keep this. And when you're on stage and you forget why you're doing this, when the crowd doesn't understand or the critics tear you apart, or you start believing you're supposed to be someone's voice instead of your own, look for that seat. Remember Thomas. Remember that someone is always listening who needs the truth more than the performance." Dylan tried to hand the photograph back. "I can't take this." "You already have," Eleanor said, and walked out of the Gaslight Cafe. Dylan kept the photograph. Tucked it into his guitar case. For the next 34 years, through every transformation, going electric at Newport, the motorcycle accident, the Christian period, the comeback tours, that photograph traveled with him. And when he performed, his eyes would drift to the 3rd row, right side. Looking for Eleanor. She came to shows when she could. New York mostly. Sometimes Philadelphia. Once she drove to Boston in winter just to sit in her seat and listen. They never spoke again after that night at the Gaslight. Just that nod. His acknowledgement that he saw her, that he remembered Thomas, that he was trying to believe what he sang. The last time Dylan saw Eleanor was 1981. A show at the Beacon Theatre. She was 75 years old, moving slower, but still there. Still in that seat. Still listening with her eyes closed. After that show, Dylan asked his road manager to get her contact information. To send her tickets whenever they were in New York. To make sure she always had that 3rd row seat. The road manager came back with news. Eleanor had given them her daughter's address. Said she wouldn't be coming to shows anymore. Didn't explain why. Dylan sent tickets anyway. Every New York show. Every tour. For 16 years, he sent tickets to Eleanor's daughter's address with a note. 3rd row, right side. For Thomas. They were never used. The daughter never explained why. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Minneapolis. November 1997. The Orpheum Theatre. Dylan stood on stage, staring at that empty seat, and understood. Eleanor was gone. He didn't know when. Didn't know how. But he knew, with the certainty that sometimes arrives without explanation, that Eleanor Whitmore would never sit in another 3rd row seat again. The audience waited. Confused. Concerned. Some thought maybe Dylan was having a stroke. Some thought it was performance art. Most just sat in uncomfortable silence, wondering if they should applaud or leave or do something. Dylan's guitar tech started to move toward the stage. The tour manager in the wings made a gesture to cut the lights, go to intermission, figure out what was happening. But Dylan moved first. He lifted the guitar strap over his head. Set the instrument down gently on its stand. Walked to the front of the stage. Sat down on the edge, legs dangling over the side, close enough to the audience that he could have reached out and touched the people in the front row. He looked at the empty seat. Then he looked at the woman sitting beside it. "Ma'am," Dylan said, his voice rough and quiet, barely carrying past the first few rows. "That seat. Do you know why it's empty?" The woman looked startled. She glanced at the empty seat, then back at Dylan. I bought 2 tickets. My mother was supposed to come. She died last week." The words hung in the air. Dylan nodded slowly. "What was her name?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Whitmore." Someone in the audience gasped. Several people who'd been at Dylan shows for decades, who knew the stories that traveled in whispers through fan circles, understood immediately what was happening. Dylan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "Your mother," he said to the woman, his voice barely steady, "taught me something 34 years ago. She told me to always look for a seat. 3rd row, right side. To remember that someone is listening who needs the truth." He stood up, walked back to his guitar, picked it up and slipped the strap back over his shoulder. "This song," Dylan said to the 400 people in the Orpheum Theatre, "I wrote when I was 22. I thought I knew what it meant. I thought it was about walking away. About being free." He positioned his fingers on the fretboard. "But your mother taught me it's about something else. It's about the people who listen when you've stopped believing. The people who hold the seat even when they can't sit in it anymore." Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. He didn't play "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right." Instead, he started playing a song he hadn't performed in 20 years. "Tomorrow Is a Long Time," one of his earliest compositions. A song about missing someone. About distance and longing and the way time stretches when you're separated from what matters. His voice cracked on the first verse. He didn't try to hide it. He let it crack and continued anyway, singing to that empty seat, singing to Eleanor Whitmore who had sat in 1,000 third-row chairs believing his words when he'd stopped believing them himself. The audience sat motionless. Some were crying. The woman whose mother had died, Eleanor's daughter, had her hands over her face, shoulders shaking. When Dylan finished, he didn't wait for applause. He set his guitar down again, walked to the edge of the stage, looked directly at Eleanor's daughter. "Your mother gave me something once," he said. "A photograph of her son, Thomas. I've carried it for 34 years. After tonight, I'm going to have it framed. And I'm going to put a second picture in that frame." He paused. "Your mother. In the seat she chose. So I never forget why I'm standing here." The applause when it came was quiet, reverent. Not the explosive celebration of entertainment, but the soft acknowledgement of witnessing something sacred. Dylan finished the show. Played 6 more songs. But everyone in the Orpheum Theatre knew the real performance had already happened in those moments of silence, staring at an empty seat. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. After the tour ended, Dylan tracked down a photograph of Eleanor. Her daughter sent him one from the 1970s, Eleanor sitting in the audience at a small venue, eyes closed, listening. He had it professionally framed with the photograph of Thomas that Eleanor had given him in 1963. The 2 images sit side by side in his home. Thomas in his military uniform with his guitar. Eleanor in her third-row seat, lost in music. On the frame, a small engraved plate. "The ones who listen when we forget to believe." Dylan still tours. He's in his 80s now. The never-ending tour continues. But something changed after that night in Minneapolis. He doesn't play to the massive crowds anymore. He prefers smaller venues. Intimate theaters where you can see the third row clearly. And before every show, his tour manager reserves a seat. Third row, right side. It stays empty. Always. When people ask why, Dylan never explains. He just plays. And sometimes, between songs, his eyes drift to that empty seat and he nods. The photograph sits in his dressing room now. Thomas and Eleanor. The musician who never got to record his songs. The mother who listened when no one else understood. Share and subscribe, Some stories deserve to be remembered. Dylan learned something that night in Minneapolis that he'd been too young to understand in 1963. The empty seats matter as much as the full ones. Sometimes more. The ones who listened when we forgot to believe, they never really leave.